evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know I say this every time, but either the lights are getting brighter or my eyesight's getting worse, and I'm not sure which, but I know you're out there. Thanks for joining us. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. We're here for what's actually our final lecture of the semester. We saved the best for last. We're pleased to welcome our colleague Tony Pipa out from Brookings. Tony's been visiting with classes and municipal county leaders, and he'll continue doing that through the week, as our scholars do. We're always happy to be here in our home of Greenspun College and in this auditorium. And so if you're watching us on our website via YouTube or on public television, welcome to you as well. The PowerPoint that Tony's going to walk through tonight is already up on our website, so you'll be able to refer to that if you have any need to. And I mentioned it's our last lecture, but it's not our last event of the semester. You'll be getting announcements about a pre-election event we'll be doing on November 1st in the afternoon. We'll have some Brookings and UNLV scholars talking about what may happen during the election. And then on the 7th, right after the election, we'll have a similar panel talking about what the previous panel got wrong, probably. So, but join us for those. Also, in between those events on the evening of November 5th, we'll be showing the first Brookings documentary film with our colleague John Hudak on the topic of medical marijuana. So a busy few days ahead for us. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. Tony is a senior fellow in Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. And in that capacity, he studies how economic mobility and security and democratic cohesion and governance can be advanced. And he's done that on the global scale. Tonight he's going to talk to us about that, but he's also going to bring it down to the metro and, in fact, the local level here in Las Vegas. Tony attended Stanford University, graduated from Duke University, has earned a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. And so he has an interesting and diverse background in government and in the philanthropic sector to address the issues tonight. Tony, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction, and thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Las Vegas and in the Mountain West, and I've really appreciated the hospitality, and it's been great to engage with the students, and in the classes I've really enjoyed it. So thanks for being here. So I'm going to start my presentation with a story about failure. It's failure on a global scale, in fact. And what am I talking about? So one of the best measures of a country's development is the extent to which a parent experiences the unnecessary death of a child before his or her 5th birthday. So it's one of the social indicators that really differentiates those societies that are doing well and being successful from those societies that are struggling. And recognizing this, in 2000, the global community agreed to set a goal to reduce the unnecessary deaths of children under 5 by 2/3 by 2015. Okay? So this is an attempt to make progress against one of the worst deprivations that we have on the planet today, and in very difficult places, poor places. So that was the goal. And how did we do? We failed. But unlike much of the recent news, this failure is actually also a story of progress, and it's a story of optimism. It's uplifting, and it resulted in very real things happening and very real lives being saved. So the way this happens is in 2012, I was working at USAID. So we're 4/5 of the way to 2015. And we realized that we weren't on track, that the global community wasn't on track to actually reach this goal. We were going to fall far short, and so what could we do to speed up progress? And we started talking to international experts. those who work in this particular field. We had our own experts. And we went to the data. And we said to ourselves, so what's happening? What's going on? Setting the goal had been very helpful. It sort of gets everybody on the same page, political leaders, those who are providing assistance like us through the US government, big multilateral agencies, foundations, investors, organizations that are working in this country. And everybody had agreed on the metrics and the data to use it, so we had this data. And what we found was that the situation was particularly lagging in a small set of countries and for a particular set of reasons. So looking at that data and understanding it, we in the US government decided that we would help create a call to action for the global community. We worked with the leaders of 2 of the countries where specifically a large share of the burden was in not being able to meet this goal. Presidents of the prime ministers and the leaders of Ethiopia and India. And jointly we worked with UNICEF and others to do a call to action, to say we're going to do what's necessary to be able to accelerate progress. We were going to look at the promising policy interventions, they were going to commit to them, and then people would invest in them. And in fact, that call to action ended up with over a couple of hundred of international non-governmental organizations, more than 200 faith-based organizations. It became quite a combined strategy and experience. And the US, for our part, decided we would focus our efforts, we'd double down in 24 of the countries that made up 80% of the under 5 deaths, and that we would focus our interventions on causes and reasons that were making up about 60% of those deaths. So in the end, we actually didn't make it. We didn't get to 2/3 reduction by 2015. So we didn't make that goal that we had set out for ourselves. But progress was really significant. In fact, after that call to action I talked about, just 2 years later, we estimated that we saved an additional 500,000 lives just by coming together and being focused on that particular objective together, understanding the contributions each stakeholder could make, and doubling down and doing it. And in fact, over the 15-year period, even though we didn't get to 2/3 reduction, it's been estimated that 8.8 million lives were saved just due to that particular goal. Now, we didn't make 2/3 reduction, but the world did make more than a 50% reduction in that time period. And the progress is actually substantial and continues today. So it continues to go on. So failure, but substantial progress. And by the way, this is just one example of significant global progress that the world's experienced over the last couple of years. So just as an aside, we're very close actually to ending extreme poverty in the world, the worst deprivation that there is in the world, which frankly would be quite a human achievement. Something that's very underreported, almost unknown, but we're actually at less than 10% of extreme poverty in the world right now. And much of the progress has been over the last 2 decades. Yes, that is worth applause. Exactly.
How do you measure those?
You measure it, it's under $1.90 a day. People who are actually consuming what they're doing every day under $1.90 a day. So what is that global picture that I just talked about? What does that have to do with Las Vegas and Clark County? I'm talking about something that's pretty far away. Frankly, under 5 mortality in the United States, that's an issue that we've dealt with pretty well. We still have some gaps. There's still some progress that we can make as a country and as a community, but frankly, we're doing quite well. But what I think about that is really compelling about that example is that as a community, we were able to make substantial social progress against really great odds. And how did we do it? So we did it by setting a goal and going after that goal. So it's outcome-based, time-bound goal. Very concrete. It was ambitious, but not crazy. It's something that other countries had gotten to. You didn't have to, getting to that goal didn't mean sort of getting to a place that's unrecognizable on the planet. It's grounded in data. It's measurable. It's comparable. You can compare that data from country to country and community to community. And we were collecting the data to be able to understand it. And we had agreement on how it was measured. Everybody was measuring it in a similar way. There was a deadline, 15 years. That's what we're going towards. It's time-bound. And it had a political commitment, strong political will from the very top that was able to, create momentum amongst others. And in fact, these are really the very characteristics that made President Kennedy's moonshot so powerful. I mean, there it is right there. So you've got, a time-bound goal before the decade is out. Pretty clear and measurable. We're getting someone to the moon and safely returning that person to Earth. And you've got political will. You've got the president speaking that and saying, we are going to commit to this as a society and as a country. So, and think of it yourself. Do you set goals for yourself? Isn't that the way in which you think of actually attaining something that you really want and helping yourself sort of progress along a line to get there? So just to tell a story, I used to play tennis at a pretty high level. And I learned from sports psychology to imagine myself winning. And one of the things you have to do, like if you want to win Wimbledon, you have to actually close your eyes, visualize, see yourself on the court playing in a tough match at Wimbledon and then winning. Because you can't win Wimbledon unless you've thought that you can win Wimbledon, unless you've actually imagined it. And that's sort of what goal setting helps us to do. So how many of you know goals that your communities have set for themselves? And actually really specific and time-bound ones. Think about that. It's not the way we normally think about what social progress looks like at the local level. But this is actually the discipline that we use when we make investments overseas. We use data and we use time-bound objectives to get there, and we use that measurement in between as a way of mobilizing action. And frankly, it's a way for us as a government, when we make foreign aid available, to know that we're trying to get the maximum return on investment. And it's also a way of realizing that social progress isn't automatic, even if you have things like economic growth. So you're even intentionally targeting a particular dimension of social progress or human development while we're making those investments. And you marry those two things together and you say, that's how we're going to make sure we do the best we can and we get the greatest return when we make those investments. And it makes sense that we should aim to maximize that return on investment with our taxpayer dollars at home here and how we do that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a set of goals that actually can help us do that as communities. Now, they're called the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs for short. These are a set of goals agreed to at the national level by national leaders under the auspices of the United Nations, but they really aren't the United Nations goals. In fact, these were developed by a host of people, including just citizens of the world. There was an online survey that even 8 million people responded to and helped set the priorities for, but there were experts from think tanks and universities like we're here today. There were people from different countries, diplomats. There were people who were being affected by these goals. And they are a very wide-ranging agenda. They pretty much describe everything that's important for development. Everything, if you look at the beginning goals around poverty and hunger and health and well-being, education, gender equality. So there's a whole set that are on the social and human development side. Then you've got decent work and economic growth, infrastructure, reduced inequality, so a whole set that are around economics and economic growth. And then the latter set is all around sustainability, sustainable consumption and production, environmental sustainability. Underneath each of these goals is a set of targets and ways to measure how close we're getting to those targets. Now, they're not perfect. They do represent a political compromise in some respects. But most of them have some quantitative targets behind them and ways to measure what progress looks like. And in fact, they're relevant for anywhere you live. These are not goals that are just for, societies that are struggling or poor countries. And when you think about it, this is what they really do is lay out an agenda that even makes sense to the United States right now. So you want to reinvigorate economic growth, which is what a lot of our political focus has been recently. But it's important to connect economic growth to social well-being. And in fact, a lot of what's been happening in the United States is certain geographic communities and certain demographics actually being left behind even as that economic growth happens. And so what the Sustainable Development Goals try to do is actually connect those two back together and also disconnect that economic growth from what you would think of as environmental bads. And so we want to grow in a way that is actually sustainable for the environment and the resources that we're using to be able to grow, rather than doing things that are continuing to stress the environment as we go forward. And this is very relevant. And in fact, I have picked some targets, just cherry-picked them from the agenda. And the first number is the actual goal, was the number. And then the second number is the number of the target underneath that goal. But just look at target 1.2 and target 10.1. So reduce poverty by 50%, and then sustain the income growth of the bottom 40% at a rate higher than the national average. And if the United States were to do that, just think of what sort of the social progress would be. That would be sort of what we're struggling with in many of the political conversations that we're having right now. And in fact, if you halved poverty by 2030 in the US, that's basically taking 20 million people out of poverty as it relates to the national poverty line in the US. And in fact, target 10.1, around that bottom 40%, even with our economic growth happening the way it is and low unemployment right now in the US, actually that's going backwards. So the bottom 40% is not growing faster than the national average. It's growing actually 0.3% slower than the national average right now. And if you did something like have the number of traffic deaths from accidents, that would save 16,000 lives. So these are actual real impacts if you think about this and you really attempt to do it. Now the interesting thing about the SDGs is how widely they've been embraced. So this was not something that I think was anticipated when they were created, but they've really become sort of a common language for leaders that are corporate leaders, celebrities, but also leaders from anywhere that are thinking about sort of on long-term sustainability and long-term social progress. Caesars Entertainment is developing a social sustainability roadmap at the corporate level that shows how their priorities align to the Sustainable Development Goals. Citibank has actually created a whole pamphlet. You can go online and see specific things that they're doing through their business as well as their philanthropy that they think are contributing to making progress on the SDGs. And Impact Nevada, which is a sustainability nonprofit here, actually their 2018 sustainability report on Southern Nevada actually mapped initiatives that are happening here against the SDGs. So they're becoming sort of the lingua franca when you think about development and you think about social sustainability. And it's part of this global movement. CalPERS, which is the California Pension Fund, is actually doing an analysis looking at all of their investments and how they map to the SDGs. PIMCO is actually talking about creating SDG bonds. In fact, the capital markets are very interested because it gives them a way to think about how their investments might be hitting a social and sustainability bottom line as well as a financial bottom line. So communities are also starting to recognize the applicability of the agenda as a potential community blueprint and as a planning tool at the local level, a way to measure their own progress. There is a city's goal, and that city's goal is focused on creating sustainable and resilient cities, and that's a recognition that over the next 15 years, which is the time of the agenda, there's going to be increasingly more and more people everywhere living in urban areas, and so we need to get that right if we're going to achieve sustainability. But at the same time, cities are protagonists and towns are protagonists. In fact, towns and cities are the places where people interact with their government most directly. That's where they feel the actions most directly of what's happening at the local level. And frankly, the SDGs sort of encompass all the different things that a government's trying to do. Everything from address the social services end to the sustainability and the infrastructure and everything in between. So what I like to do is sort of take us a little bit on a journey and look at an analysis of using the goals as a community planning tool for the Las Vegas and Clark County area and see what it tells us. Now, colleagues at an organization called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network have actually created a U.S. Cities Index using the targets out of the SDGs and looking at the data underneath them and then ranking the top largest 100 cities in the U.S. And Las Vegas, Clark County metro area ranks actually 81 out of 100. And what I'll do in the next couple of slides is sort of, see where it points to some strengths and where it points to some weaknesses. The key is green is doing well, orange is progressing, yellow is caution, and red just not doing very well. But I'll go through that. Now, the interesting thing about the goals that I think is important to keep in mind, and in some respects it's easy to adopt the goals. And by adopt, I mean let's just map actually what our reality looks like against the targets and against the measurements that the goals and the targets use. But then to actually implement them, which means doing your best to achieve them, that's actually really hard. And cities like New York and Los Angeles, which their mayors have actually publicly committed them to making progress on the SDGs, even they're struggling with what does that look like? What does that mean? It requires sort of aligning policy and budget, but then also requires a lot of partnership with others that are even outside government, because these are pretty ambitious. So, notable strengths when you look at what was in that index. Lots of strength on the sustainability side, actually. In fact, one of the highest marks out of the whole index on water sustainability. Green energy. The metro area has the highest solar per capita capacity nationwide of any city, which is pretty phenomenal. And even climate emissions, 10th in the nation in sort of reduction of climate emissions. And jobs, frankly. I mean, employment is growing, especially in the last couple of years. Among the highest employment growth in metro communities nationwide. And unemployment continues to fall and is decreasing at good rates. But interestingly, some of the weakness is poverty, and in fact, not just the rate of poverty, but also the personal income per capita. So even though that unemployment is falling, the income is not balancing to a place where people at the low end of the scale have what they need. Last quartile, these are all last quartile on the index, actually. So food insecurity, which means that some people don't have what they need to have nutrition on a daily basis. Healthcare coverage, as well as healthcare accessibility. Low number of primary care physicians per 100,000, score very low, actually, on that metric. Education, both with high school completion rates as well as undergraduate degrees, is fairly low, comparatively speaking, to counterparts. Things like disconnected use of sustainable transportation. So this is measured by how many people above the age of 16 who are working are getting to work either by walking, biking, or on public transportation. And so even though you've got high sustainability on some of the environmental indicators, something like transportation and accessibility to transportation scores low. Now here, I'll take you through a series of graphs that show the application of how targets and goals help you think about things. So I had a conversation with a set of cities who are working around the SDGs, and I just picked these 5 because these are a common set that they all said, we care about as cities. So shared prosperity and jobs, making sure that you've got the job growth you want, affordability of housing, air quality, transportation, accessibility, and violence. So I'm just using those as sort of the basis for saying, let's say that those are our priorities for the night, and let's look at setting some targets and goals and what that tells us. Now in poverty, so the target would be to have poverty by 2030 with the starting point at 2015. If you look at the orange line, so the blue line is where you've been, and if you look at the orange line and you sort of continue, we did some analysis that takes those previous 10 to 15 years and have mapped it out to say, what would business as usual? If you didn't do anything, where would you get to? And then the gray line is where you would need to get to have poverty by 2030. And that block in the middle is what you would need to accelerate or do to get yourself there. So that represents a focused effort. And that would represent a focused effort on behalf not just of the local governments, although obviously they would have to be in a leadership position on that, because they would want to be thinking about what are the policy interventions we might need to make, how can our services and how can the way in which we're thinking about jobs and growth help with this. But it would also have to happen in conjunction with others, with citizens, but with nonprofits, with foundations, with businesses, a whole set of others. And it helps you sit down and say, if we're all going to actually achieve this, how do we get there? Sort of like what we did with the call to action. Where are the neighborhoods where this is occurring? What's happening? What would we have to do to be able to get people actually at higher incomes with jobs that are either paying better or getting them into jobs that they aren't in already? This is around housing. And this is improving affordability by 50% by 2030. So the dark blue line is actually home ownership. So if you want, and the way we usually measure affordability and access to affordability is if you're spending less, you want to be spending households less than 30% of their income on housing itself. So on home ownership affordability, actually doing quite well. Not much needs to change. One thing I would say is, what I'm showing here is a pretty crude analysis. We're not taking into account, increased population. If we had some more time, we would be doing those sorts of calculations, and that would certainly affect probably the affordability for the home ownership line, and there would be other factors as well we take into account. But by and large, from a home ownership perspective, and in fact that's one of the selling points that I understand for the area, doing pretty well, doing quite well comparatively speaking. But on rental housing, would need to actually make some focused effort to be able to get there, if that was the goal. The other thing to keep in mind is that unsheltered homeless rose also by 14% in 2017 alone. And so in terms of shelter and access to shelter, that would also be another dynamic that you'd need to take into account. Violence. Interestingly here, you've got a trend where, homicide violence, and this was just in Las Vegas Metro, actually declined by half, which would be the target, from 2005 down to 2012. So it's actually doable. But then it started to go back up and almost went back up to about where it started from, which means that the trend is continuing up. And if you wanted to have that again, there would be a concerted effort. But that's interesting. So what happened in there? Was that population loss because of the recession? Was that not as much business? What was going, or was that certain safety parameters and ratios of public safety to residents? And then what might be the reasons why it started to rise? But that gives you a really nice way to think about this is actually quite doable if you can bring the stakeholders together to think about and analyze what was happening and sort of get that back. Another thing, though, around violence, one of the weaknesses is around sex trafficking. And it's actually second highest in the US and has tripled over the last 4 years. We didn't have enough data to be able to do this sort of trajectory analysis, but it's certainly going the wrong way. And that would be another potential priority that the community could look at and take on. Back to sort of sustainable accessibility for mobility and transportation, as well as traffic deaths. Again, traffic deaths was very similar to homicides in Las Vegas Metro. Deaths were cut in half from 2005 to 2009, and that's actually the target, but then increased almost back to where it started from over 6 years as well. So again, thinking about how did it go down? What do we do to keep it there? And to get it there and to keep it there? And what can goals do to help us get there? What sort of planning would we be able to do? And then the last one is around air quality. And, you know, the days that are moderate are not seen as unhealthy, technically speaking, but that is a large number of days. The combination of sunlight and heat with emissions from cars make this a pretty tough environment for ongoing air quality. And some outside stakeholders have, you know, ranked the Las Vegas metro area fairly high, actually, for some of the worst air across the nation. So again, possibility of saying one of the priorities we would have is to take this on. What would that look like? What would you learn from others, other metro areas that have been able to have significant reduction? And in fact, bringing air quality up will have significant health impacts as well, positive health impacts. And that's one of the ways in which the agenda works and the way the framework works for the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of interconnections and interdependencies within the goals themselves. So in terms of what's there for a local community, what it really requires, obviously, is some political commitment and some willingness to think in terms of a goal orientation and a data-driven orientation. What was challenging, one of the things that was challenging even for us doing this initial analysis is also the complicated jurisdictional structures that there are here with the cities and the county. And so figuring that out and who would actually even be owner of certain portions of it, I think you'd have to do some more, you'd have to do a deeper dive and look at some more granular data so you could look at what cities and what neighborhoods are really be affected by the priorities that you're taking on. But the advantages are really that you've got a common language that is really, you know, common to different communities and countries taking this on. Using the set of targets and the set of data that it was even used in the index, and there's more beyond that, provides you comparability with your counterparts across the United States and frankly counterparts globally, which also provides you an opportunity to share lessons and best practices and learn from each other and be very pragmatic about that back and forth. The interdependence of the framework provides you the opportunity to understand that making progress on one can actually affect progress on others. And using this sort of future analysis where you've got a time-bound target supported by data really can highlight the challenges but also the opportunities that there is to make and accelerate the progress that you want. And at the end of the day, it provides a platform for what we sort of did through the call to action globally on under 5 mortality. It raises all sorts of questions of what are potential policy interventions that could be made that we can learn from. Financing, both through budgets that exist, but maybe some new financing, even if that's in conjunction with the state or the federal level, or actually with private investment or with others. Does it provide the opportunity for new public-private partnerships that you haven't, you know, thought about or undertaken yet? Even getting cities involved, the university involved in a different way. That clarity of vision and direction can really provide a motivating factor and something that is a compass to enable you to get from here to there and to ensure that we've got social progress at the same time as we have economic progress. So just in closing, I would say, you know, I always like to close with this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture of their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits." And to me, that encapsulates the Sustainable Development Goals in a nutshell. I'd have to have something in there about sustainability. We weren't quite that conscious about that back in the day. And I think that using the goals at a local level really provides the opportunity, and there will be cities, and there are increasingly cities and communities across the world doing this globally, that provides the opportunity for both stimulating social progress at the local level and being part of a global collective that's doing it. So thanks very much. So am I crazy?
Crazy.
Reactions, questions?
For the city SDG scorecard, are you able to defer if sort of how successful a city is to reaching that goals if there's different participation of different groups in that city? So for example, more participation from the government versus more participation from the citizens of the community, if that has any correlative effects.
We haven't done that analysis. That's an interesting question, actually. It was the second year for the index. The furthest they've gotten on the analysis is how close would each city potentially get, sort of, and even the top city, which was the San Jose metro area, is only 65%, that part of the way to achieving the goals. But actually thinking about what's, having more impact there, is it government? Is it outside stakeholders? Is it types of partnerships? That sort of analysis is not, that's actually what, some of part of what I hope to be doing actually through the project that I'm starting to incubate at Brookings, which will be bringing cities together that are taking implementation seriously so that they can exchange lessons on both the challenges that they are encountering, but also how they're solving those challenges and the opportunities that it's bringing. And it is that switch from getting your baselines, which is what a lot of this was, to then, okay, now what do we do about it? And what do solutions look like? And I think it will look different in different contexts. Certainly globally it will look different in different contexts because of the ways in which governance is set up. Some cities have more autonomy than others when you look at their counties or their states or their federal governments differently than US cities do. Yeah, I think there will even be different answers for different cities depending on size, depending on what the corporate culture is. And you're already even seeing different pathways to cities taking it on. Sometimes it's not actually the city government that's out in front and saying we want to do this. Sometimes it's the business community. Bogota was the Chamber of Commerce, for example, that got the conversation started. Sometimes it's the philanthropic community in the US in a couple of places where they're starting to think about it. It's been either a local foundation or a community foundation because it gives them a framework actually to measure even their own giving and what it is they're trying to achieve. That's a good question, and trying to systematically think about that will be something that we're trying to do because then we can also develop some tools or approaches that localities can use to try to think about.
If San Jose is currently seated at sort of this gold standard level of adopting these and sort of thinking them through, have you gotten into sort of the granular level of specifically what they're doing, and does that provide any best practices for a city like Las Vegas?
Yeah, we're in early stages of doing that. And I think the one thing I would say is that those cities that are toward the top of the ranking don't do as badly on where their weaknesses are and tend to do really well on where their strengths are. And so it's a little bit sort of across the board. There's, a little more consistency, shall we say, versus, real strong weaknesses in one or other areas, I guess I would say. But yeah, in terms of the implementation and in terms of what's really working, because, so we're, almost now, we're 3 years into the agenda itself, but it wasn't like cities started to do this immediately and started to think about it. So we're actually still in the early stages of cities themselves thinking about what implementation looks like. And even Los Angeles was at the beginning of the year, their mayor committed the city to pursue the SDGs. They spent a lot of time actually getting their baselines in order and looking at their targets and what the targets really are. And now they're just sort of turning to, okay, what are our priorities out of this? And what are we going to do about it? Now, some of those are priorities they've already been working on. Like ending homelessness is going to be a big priority for them. And it's something they've been actually thinking about and grappling with for, the better part of a decade and even more. But what's interesting now, and this happened even before they, sort of pursued the SDGs and the mayor made the public commitment, they've actually set a very specific time-bound goal around ending homelessness with a midpoint benchmark. And they've done a couple of bond issues, both at the city and county level, to actually get money to do mobile shelters and other things that they think they're going to need to be able to end or at least significantly reduce homelessness. And I think that's one of the other important points. So ending homelessness that's an ambitious goal. Let's not downplay how difficult that would be, especially in a city that size where they're also doing lots of other things that they need to be doing and running, and a problem that's been pretty intransigent. I mean, it's a difficult challenge there. And yet, even if you don't get all the way there, my sense is that they're going to make really significant progress, given just both the political will and the solutions that they're going to be testing out and trying to undertake.
Unfortunately, a lot of the challenges are at the federal level. I started working in prehistoric Cleveland, I like to say, back in the 60s as a engineer planner. And it was about the time that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. And we were trying to do things locally, but unfortunately the state was kind of less than helpful in trying to enable us to get data and stuff like that. Well, at that time we had an energetic mayor, Carl Stokes, and he and others at the time, Cuyahoga River, of course, caught on fire, were able to assist in creating the Environmental Protection Agency. But without that assistance on the federal level, I'm not, eventually we may have solved the problem, but it would have been a lot more difficult.
That is certainly one of the issues that localities will face when actually attempting to use this as a tool to make progress. And in fact, I was in Los Angeles last week, and we had a long conversation about the interplay between city and county. So for example, what's not in their managerial interest are even health and education, because those are county owned, so to speak. That's county budget. And they were also talking about sort of hunger and food insecurity. Like, they depend on SNAP and other federal programs to a large degree, that's not within their managerial interest. That would be really important if they took those on. So they're eager for some more analysis around that. How do they decouple and sort of pull the threads of what are things that they can really significantly impact just from what's in their managerial interest to what is also a partnership with other parts of government, whether it be at the county, state, or federal level, and thinking more about the interplay there. If everyone were, sort of on the same page, and if you had the federal government embracing this, now our current administration hasn't really. They see it as a previous administration's commitment and agreement, and even given the skepticism that comes with sort of cooperative agreements like this, they've really ignored it. It's been sort of like benign neglect. But you could see that if you had all engines firing, and when before I left the administration, for example, USDA made a strong commitment to the sustainable consumption and production target around 50% decrease in food waste and loss. So if USDA is committed to that, and Las Vegas is committed to that, and Los Angeles is committed to that, and even states are committed to it, then you have a bit of a perfect storm, and you have actually different levels of government thinking about, okay, how can we really solve this together?
You almost need a dramatic event.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but it's also leadership. I mean, you know, leadership in those particular places could be a part of it. And that's what we, you know, it's interesting because it's a 15-year agenda. That's what we sort of experienced globally sometimes. You would have a country that might make up a large share of the burden of a particular target. The leadership of that country might not be too focused on it or care too much about it, but then you'd have an election, and all of a sudden someone comes in, they think it's a priority. They have lots of willing partners because lots of other partners have already adopted these as well and think it's a priority. And then you can actually really accelerate and make some significant progress pretty quickly. And in fact, the former set of goals, you know, the US, for example, didn't really embrace or sign on for the first 8 years of that 15-year period. But once we got involved, we were able to really be a big part of some important progress that's made. So, that will be a really interesting part of the global exchange as well, is this interplay between different governments. Sweden, for example, has a lot of autonomy at the local level, both the county and the town municipality level. And they are taking this very seriously. They have loads of towns actually really thinking seriously about this. But they also have a fair amount of freedom. And they have a willing partner in their federal government because their federal government actually believes it's pretty important as well. And that will be different than places, you know, other places where there's actually not very much autonomy at the city level or even the county level, and it's really like the provincial or the state level and the federal level. But I think it's actually interesting then to use this framework to think about, well, what are those dynamics? And where do you really need to lay the responsibility at the federal level and say, this is what we need. You know, we as a community want to have this. We want to be able to make this particular progress. We need your partnership and help to be able to do it. Gives your, you know, representatives something to talk about in Washington for sure, and at least gives you a clearer sense of what's possible, what's in the realm of possible locally as well.
I just see that the biggest problem here is that the government doesn't know anything about PR and marketing. All the good people, you know, who are good at that don't work for the government. So you end up with this little piece of paper on the outside of an EDD, you know, push board that says, looking for entrepreneurs who might want to work with a community. I mean, like, you're not going to find any stars like that, right? So when you look at the Department of Commerce and Solution Technology and all these amazing brains like yours that are like, oh, totally on it. You being totally on it and everyone else being completely ignorant that a city has made a commitment. City's made a commitment, now you can hold them to their accountability. You can bring sustainable solutions. When a friend of mine said, when saving the planet becomes profitable, the planet will be saved. So making somebody look good in their job is profitable. Having these cities, countries, communities showcase their awesomeness by having a set of, you know, deliverables, like where they can prove it, like a little community that has a little bit more autonomy could go balls to the wall and be like, look, we're stars, woohoo, leading outside, you know, leading from Henderson, who knows? Right. But I think there's some combination of like a special agency, some sort of conduit that lets people know, like 100% awareness of the strategic alliance or the divine sort of astronomy of getting your needs and the commitments that you could hold your community accountable to. But it gives you, like, for instance, if we're talking about housing and the homelessness problem, and a lot of people who will become transient that didn't expect to be, all kinds of reasons for how that happens. We're gonna have to have like real understanding that the building departments aren't gonna get in our way when we're trying to do experiments on new types of housing, new types of developments. I mean, a business developer, it's impossible to bring something that is, unless we start talking about an experiment that lines up with this and that. I could bring, all kinds of people to the table as long as we know that we've got something that everybody has to adhere to, especially be accountable transparently for the money they're taking in to implement. If they give all these grants, right, if they give all these grants and these people come in and do all this stuff, and the reality is it's just a big real estate play.
So I think that's, a few different reactions to that. So I do think that that's one of the potential powers of a framework like this, is that it takes it out of the ad hoc nature and says, how does this funnel into us making progress on X, Y, or Z? Right. This is where we're going. This is our North Star. This is where we want to get to. And so there's lots of things we could do, but what we need to be thinking about is how we're going to get there. So I think that's one point. Second point, I really agree about the PR, frankly, and I think if you're serious about taking on a set of objectives, let's even say you do your baseline against this framework and against these sustainable development goals, and you pick 2 to 3 priorities as a community that you say, this is really where we need to double down, we think is really important as a community over the next 10 years. Yes, you need to be shouting that from the rooftops, because you need everybody to be thinking about how they can contribute, and not just financially. Like, businesses have an enormous amount to contribute just from their expertise, what they understand about their value chains and their distribution. I mean, there's lots of ways in which nonprofits, businesses, foundations, universities can contribute. But it also means often a different skill set for the city officials if they're going to be the ones in the lead, because it's not just about what's our fiscal, what is our budget and how do we need to align our policy to get more out of it, because these are going to be more ambitious than what you can just do with your government revenue. So you are actually going to need other partners. So it really is getting, both marketing and then getting and leveraging the expertise that's really out there and thinking about partnership in a new way and thinking about your role in a different way. So I think that's a big part of it as well. And you might need innovations. You might need to experiment. You might not have found the thing that is going to get the biggest bang for the buck yet.
How could we have found it? We just started talking about that we were all aligned on possibly agreeing to get somewhere.
They started with the MGG, the Gates guys, Millennial Development Goals.
What do you think about the Melinda and what's his name is Gates process? Sorry.
I was just struck, thank you for the data you brought. And it was interesting that you confirmed what I think people who live and work here know, is that Las Vegas is, on the environmental side, is a very sustainable and getting even more sustainable place. Not something that people who don't know about Las Vegas would expect or even believe necessarily. But it's in that sort of rankings of cities, and where that's something Las Vegas could bring to the table and share. If I remember right, Orlando seemed to be ranked high on that list of cities, and that's a region we compare ourselves to a lot because we share that same economy of having a core economy of tourism and visitors, and yet Orlando was ranked quite high there, and so I assume something we could learn from. So cities being able to identify the right cities to compare yourselves to is important.
And Orlando would be a great one because they have decided to align their plans against the Sustainable Development Goals, actually. And so that gives you, and they are adopting sort of the comparable set of data to measure against that. That, if you did something similar here, you'd actually have data, you'd actually have point to point to be able to compare on the World City Council of data. But I think it's a good point, actually, looking for like-minded and comparable cities to share lessons. I mean, the other part of this, what I'm finding is that, so I just come out of a experience where I'm representing the United States globally. And when you're nation state to nation state, there's always politics at play. But what's very interesting to me, at least for a larger portion of the time, is that cities tend to be very pragmatic. There's not a lot of, there is some competition, and competition can actually be a good thing. But they're also very interested in sharing those solutions and actually looking at what's worked in one place and how you adapt it and modify it and apply it in another place as well. And you have a lot of networks of cities doing that on many different areas of development. Everything from the 100 resilient cities and C40, which is around climate, to safe cities, smart cities. There's somewhere in the realm of 100 to 200 city networks actually where they're sharing lessons and ideas back and forth. Yeah, pick your issue. Then the interesting thing about this is then that takes all those issues and tries to put them together. And when you're, I see this, I see a lot of what's happening economically in the U.S. requiring place-based solutions because you have different geographies and different demographics within those geographies that are really the ones being left behind or being affected as the economy is changing so dramatically. And so you really have to be sensitive to what does that mean in terms of place, and this gives you a way to do it and do it in a way that's comparable with others as well, that then opens up those conversations that you're talking about. Provides at least the potential for it. So.
Did I ask the last question? I don't want to usurp anybody's. Okay, great. Thank you, sir, for your presentation.
Thank you, great comments.
Thank you all for joining us. Remember my commercial at the start about our events coming up. You'll be seeing and reading about them. We hope to see you at them if your schedules permit. And we're working on our lecture schedule for the fall. By we, I mean Caitlin Saladino, not me. And so keep an eye on your inbox. We'll have visiting scholars out in the spring semester with another series of lectures. Thanks again.
Can we see this online now or anytime soon? I'd like to see what I missed.
Yes, if you check our website, you'll see the folks here at Greenspun Hall will have the lecture up on our website in a week or so.
Outstanding.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.